It's a Friday evening in 1965, and a young woman hands over a single-pound note at the corner shop till. The shopkeeper counts out her change slowly, working through shillings and pence rather than a single simple number, laying the coins out one by one on the counter so she can check the sum herself. By the time he's finished, she's walking out with a full basket, a few coins still rattling loose in her purse, and the whole transaction has barely dented that £1 note. A single pound in 1965 could do genuinely startling things. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how far it stretched, across food, a night out, getting around, and even a house, and why that same pound would barely cover a single pint today. To understand what a pound could buy in 1965, it helps to understand what a pound actually was to most people that year. The average worker earned somewhere between £17 and £19 a week, adding up to something close to £960 across the whole year. That made a single pound worth roughly a day's wages for an ordinary working person. Not the loose pocket change it can feel like today. Money itself looked and worked differently too. Britain hadn't yet decimalised its currency in 1965, so every transaction ran on pounds, shillings, and pence. 12 pence to a shilling, 20 shillings to a pound. Prices were quoted in figures like 2 and 4 pence, rather than a single decimal number. And shop assistants worked out the sums by hand, without a calculator anywhere in sight, adding up columns of shillings and pence the way most of us would now reach for a phone. Some of the more expensive items in shop windows were even priced in guineas, an old unit worth £1 and 1 shilling. A small but telling sign of how differently people thought about money at the time and how many different coins a single shopping trip might actually involve, from small threepenny and sixpenny pieces right up to that solitary pound note itself. Start with the basics, and the numbers get interesting fast. A large loaf of bread cost around 1 shilling and 2 pence halfpenny. A pint of milk came to about 9 pence halfpenny, usually delivered to the doorstep before breakfast rather than bought at a shop at all. A dozen eggs ran somewhere between 3 shillings and 8 pence and 4 shillings and 6 pence, depending on the shop and the season. Since eggs were still genuinely seasonal in a way most shoppers today never have to think about. A pound of butter cost between 2 shillings and 11 pence and 4 shillings and 8 pence. With margarine sitting noticeably cheaper for families watching every penny of a tight weekly budget. Put those together, and a full week's basic food shop for a family, bread, milk, eggs, and butter, among the essentials, still only came to a small fraction of that £17 to £19 weekly wage. A morning paper on top of all that, the Daily Mirror, cost just 4 pence. Barely worth mentioning next to the rest of the weekly shop, but it's exactly the kind of small daily habit that adds up to almost nothing against a wage measured in pounds rather than pence. Groceries simply didn't dominate a household's spending the way people sometimes assume looking back at black and white photographs of ration books and corner shops from a decade or two earlier. The real financial pressure of 1965 sat elsewhere, in categories that never show up on a shopping list at all. A night out told a different story, but still a genuinely affordable one. A pint of beer cost around 2 shillings and 4 pence in the public bar, a couple of pence more, again in the lounge, if you wanted somewhere a little smarter to sit. A trip to the cinema averaged out at around 1 shilling and 7 pence a ticket, whatever happened to be showing that particular week. 20 cigarettes, still a completely ordinary purchase for most adults in 1965, came to 4 shillings and 7 pence, bought without a second thought at the counter, alongside a newspaper and the evening's change. Add all three together, a pint, a cinema ticket, and a packet of cigarettes, and an entire evening out cost less than half a day's wages for the average worker. It's easy to see why the pub and the pictures were treated as genuinely routine parts of a working week, not occasional treats saved up for months in advance. A working man could have a proper night out on a Friday, buy a round for a friend, and still have most of his wage packet intact by Saturday morning. Getting around cost more, but not necessarily in the way people might expect. Petrol came to 6 shillings and 2 pence a gallon, more than double the price of that pint of beer for a roughly comparable unit of everyday spending, but still modest set against weekly wages. The real cost sat in owning the car itself, not fueling it once you had one. A Ford Cortina, about as ordinary and mainstream a car as existed on British roads in 1965, cost £644 brand new from a showroom. That single figure put a car firmly out of reach for most working households paid week to week, rather than saved up over years. Cars existed on plenty of streets, and plenty of families aspired to one parked outside the house. But a Cortina represented something close to 8 months of an average worker's entire wage before food, rent, or anything else was accounted for. Housing was where the real weight of 1965 spending sat. The average house in Britain that year cost £3,344, against an average annual income of around £960, that put the average home at roughly 3.5 times a year's wages. That ratio matters more than the raw number on its own. A house in 1965 was genuinely expensive relative to income, but nowhere near as expensive as it would become across the following decades. A gap that size was a stretch, but a survivable one, on an ordinary wage with an ordinary mortgage from an ordinary building society on the high street, arranged over a cup of tea with a manager who likely knew the family applying for it. It's the kind of number that explains why home ownership climbed so steadily through the decade, even while wages themselves stayed modest, by comparison to what came later, and why so many young couples in 1965 could genuinely expect to own a home within a few years of marrying rather than decades of saving first. Look at all 4 categories side by side, and a clear picture starts to form. Food and a night out both cost a genuinely small fraction of a week's wage. Transport, once you moved past the fuel itself and into owning the car outright, took a much bigger bite. Housing took the biggest bite of all. And yet even that stayed within reach of an ordinary wage in a way that feels almost unimaginable looking back from today. None of this meant 1965 was an easy or comfortable year for most families. Wages were modest by any measure, and a single unexpected cost, a broken boiler, an illness, a lost week of work, could still cause real strain on a household budget with very little slack built into it. Bigger purchases made that strain obvious in a way weekly shopping never did. A new refrigerator cost around £65, and a washing machine could run to £70 or £80 depending on the model, both of them genuinely major purchases that most families saved toward for months rather than bought on a whim. But the relationship between wages and the basic everyday cost of living, food, a pint, a house, sat much closer together than it does now. A pound in 1965 wasn't simply worth more in absolute terms. It was worth more relative to what an ordinary person actually earned for a week's work. And that difference matters more than the raw price of any single item on this list. Adjusted for inflation, that same pound from 1965 works out to somewhere close to £19 in today's money. That loaf of bread, scaled up the same way, would cost roughly 89 pence, rather than the pound or more it typically costs on a shelf now. That average house, adjusted using the same measure, would sit at around £50,000 rather than the hundreds of thousands an average house actually costs today. The real story sits in the gap between those adjusted figures and the actual modern prices. Wages have grown a great deal since 1965, but the cost of housing in particular has grown considerably faster still, pulling further and further away from what wages alone can comfortably cover. That's exactly the kind of shift that never shows up clearly within a single year. It only becomes visible looking back across the distance of 60 years, £1 note at a time, 1 shilling and pence column, added up by hand at a shop counter that's long since closed. A pound in 1965 wasn't a small amount of money, and nobody treated it like one. It was a day's wage for plenty of people, a proper night out, most of a week's groceries, all rolled into a single note that got counted out carefully, coin by coin, at the till, checked twice before it ever left someone's hand. Maybe that's worth remembering next time a pound coin barely covers anything at all, sitting loose and largely ignored at the bottom of a coat pocket.